She's very serious. All right.
Thanks for letting me know.
There's no question. We're coming to you live not only from beautiful, scenic Houston, Texas, and the Rice Architecture School, but also San Francisco and New York. This is what I love about the pandemic, you guys, is it's created. I always used to think, how am I going to be able to like fly people in for these things? And it's just become wonderful in this way. And also a beautiful prison, I think, is the best way to think of it. But I really appreciate you guys coming. So why don't we start with Will? Let's start with you. Go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of explain your background really quickly.
Yeah, so I graduated from Rice School of Architecture in 2014 and then again 2016. And then I went to University of Michigan to do a really fast master's program. And it was Master of Science with a concentration in architectural research in digital technology. And then I returned, actually after master's, I returned to my preceptorship office to work for a few years. And then I think, August of last year, I changed to a new job. So right now I'm working out of office in New York. So it's been great.
Awesome. Metinee?
Yeah, hi, I'm Metinee. I graduated with my B Arts in Architecture from Rice Arc in 2019. I know some of you guys here, so hi Pete and Jaden. So yeah, I essentially didn't do the full 6 years in B Arc after kind of figuring out my senior year that I wanted to maybe look into a different field of study. And so I found UX design, ended up going to UT Austin to do a master's in information science, specializing in UX and human computer interaction. And now I am just finished with my master's program. So I'm officially a master's of science now. Yeah, and then I'll be starting my new job as a product designer at SoFi in July.
So we're going to go ahead and start. I have some questions that are prepared that I've shared with Will and Metinee for this presentation. But if you all who are watching have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll hit them at the end if we haven't covered them with the stuff that we've prepared. So the first most annoying question, I think I will start with Will, is what is UXUI? And I ask this question because, I mean, I think I know the answer. So I want to know how wrong I am, which is I've always thought of UI as like traditional web design, whereas UX takes that, but also research factors into consideration to create sort of more of a holistic product. Is that close?
Okay, I'll start, but I feel like Metinee is probably the expert on this. For me, UX, UI, so you were right. A lot of it is websites and web apps, but more in general, to me, it I guess it's buttons and sliders and text boxes, or like number tickers, all those things that you can interact with the computer, and that's more on the narrow kind of sense. In the broader sense, it's actually like door handles, dials, levers. Those things are tools with which you interact with the outside world, I guess, other than the human body. So that's kind of my understanding of UX UI, or at least that's how I've been working in UX and UI. I'm primarily working on like a web app for my company, and it's part of a SaaS product. So I have to deal with a lot of buttons and sliders, or the positioning of those, so that they can be obvious to the user and be more useful rather than clunky. So for me, that's what UX and UI has been.
All right, Metinee.
Cool, yeah. So I think pretty much similar to what both of you had said. I think for me, like the distinction between UI and UX specifically is that UI is more on the like graphic side of things. So like more literally like what are the colors you're looking at? Like what is the typeface? What should this button look like? Overall, just like that more like front end portion of it. Whereas the UX is more like stuff that you don't actually see. So how this like app is interacting with its user, how like it makes it easier for someone to complete their day-to-day job, or like some of their like more mundane tasks like banking or something. So just like ways in which designers can help people's lives be easier from that kind of like a more subtle perspective, and just like small interaction. I see UX as more of like the background interaction, sort of like things that you might not necessarily notice like as a flashy gradient or something. And yeah, just helping people like interact with technology more easily.
I read, or I watched a video, and the joke was that UI is like a Tinder profile and UX is like going on the date. And I feel like that's funny, and I kind of get it. Maybe it makes sense, but the longer I sort of talk to you guys, the more I'm getting, because it does feel like this sort of ephemeral thing where it's like, what do you do? I just work in computers. That's all you need to know.
Yeah.
So, and a way I think that it makes it a little bit easier is if we talk about just what a day looks like. So, I mean, obviously in architecture, there's not like a set day. Every day isn't the same, right? Sometimes you're working on contracts, and sometimes you're talking to clients, and sometimes you're working on construction documents or visiting a site. So what are kind of some of the big pieces like that for UX UI?
Yeah, so I guess I can speak to this based on my internship experience, since I haven't started working full time. But essentially, I would say it depends on what phase of the project you're in again. So I think typically like you will work kind of in the different phases. And so if you're doing like initial product scoping, you'll kind of be like meeting with product managers, like ideating, like using whiteboards to kind of like draw out ideas and like initial like screen concepts, like nothing concrete, but just like trying to figure out where you want this product to go, what the goal is, and priorities. There's like the kind of more research phase where you're figuring out like, okay, so what do users need? Like, how does this align with our business goals? And like, how can we kind of match up like from like a user perspective, like what we feel like are the priorities and goals versus what like actually are the priorities and goals of the people who will be using the product. And then what we probably spend the most time in is like the kind of design phase, where you're pretty much working until like the product gets launched and like built by the engineers. And that's kind of similar to what I experienced in architecture. So where you're kind of like working on a design, iterating on it, getting feedback from like other designers, your manager, possibly like product managers and other stakeholders, just like constantly kind of like reiterating on your designs. And then also gathering like user feedback sometimes, maybe if your company allows for that.
Similar for you, Will?
Not quite, actually. So I guess I should give you guys a little bit more background on the projects that I'm working on. Like I said, I'm helping my company to bring a SaaS product online, and a big part of it has to do with this web app. So right now we are really early in the process, so we don't have as many, say, user research or interviews or on that side. I guess UX isn't quite. We're not quite there yet. Right now we are prototyping a lot of user interfaces so that at least it makes sense to us, and then we are also developing those alongside with the things that we're trying to sell. So my company is still an architecture and engineering company, and we are trying to sell designs still. So, and then that's going to be delivered through this web app. So I'm kind of stepping on like two different or playing two different roles. So on the UI side or UX UI side, right now, during the day, I mock up a lot of interfaces just to kind of internally discuss whether that would be a viable workflow or intuitive kind of process for people to order or to design on their own. So part of the product is to have users design their own kind of architectural product. So that involves a lot of kind of input and parameters, things like that. So right now for me, it's definitely heavy on the user interface mockups and exercises.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I actually missed a part, but I would say for me, I was less working on the like UI side of things because like the company I work for has a specific team that works on the like look and feel of the product, I should say. And so what I was working on was less like, oh, figuring out like typefaces and like colors and stuff rather, and kind of like dragging the components into mockups and like working on those instead. So not as much like aesthetic working as much as like figuring out where things should go and like how it would be arranged.
I feel like there are a lot of parallels between architecture and this sort of digital design, because it does feel like it's trying to put together a lot of components from a lot of different users and a lot of different ideas and voices, and that is definitely a skill that I think it's honed over time in these types of careers. Lots of patience required. I did want to ask you, so architecture projects, I mean, on average, take 2 to 3 years. If you're doing an interior build out, it could be 6 to 9 months. If you're doing a humongous project, it could take 5 to 10 years. But I'd say the sweet spot is you're working on a building, if you're sticking with one building for 2 to 3 years. What have the projects like, Will, kind of what's the timeline for the project that you're working on? Do you guys have a set timeline for it? And the same question will go to you afterward, Metinee.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the type of projects. So for us, like I was saying, we are pretty heavily in the R&D phase, or rather the R phase, the research phase. So we don't quite have like deadlines. So like we have to do this in next week, or have to have this out of the door by next month. We don't have that kind of a deadline. It's a little bit loose in terms of project timelines and turnarounds. But I'd say just as a comparison to architectural projects, it does, in my experience, it does take a little bit shorter time to kind of mock up an idea to kind of make something that tells a story, just because of the scope. Like I'm going back to like buttons and sliders. It only takes so long to draw those, and to draw those beautifully, rather than making a building, so to speak, work and beautiful at the same time. So I guess just on a higher level, I would say the turnaround is going to be much faster than architecture design.
I would agree with that. I think one thing I've noticed from like hearing about friends who work at tech companies and like my experience is that like it's very efficient in the sense that like there are very much like clear set goals for timelines, and they are usually met, and there's like every team kind of like works on their specific portion, and it's like designers work a few cycles ahead of engineers, and so like by the time we're done with our designs, we give them to the engineers, they're like ready to work on it. And so that kind of syncs up really well. And I think a lot of companies like adopt that model. And so I would say the project, it depends on the like size of the project again. I think most tech companies like will come up with a like MVP, which is a minimum viable product. And that's like, so what you and your team decides is like the least like bare minimum that you would need to do to get this out the door and like in front of users, because time is always like pretty important, and like the world is pretty fast paced when it comes to technology. And so I would say if it's like you're starting from scratch, like you're just coming up with the idea and you have to do all the research and stuff, it could take like 6 months to get from like ideation to like launching, depending on like what your resources are, et cetera. It might be shorter. And then once that's out the door, you have the time to kind of like build upon that and like add features, like keep updating things based on user feedback, which is like something that again, like architecture doesn't really afford, because once you build a building, it's not like you can go in and be like, let me just change this wall real quick. And so features specifically, like I think that's generally what most people would work on. That usually I think would take between like 3 months, like that seems like kind of the maximum. Like we kind of work in quarters. So usually each quarter, like you'll be working on a few different features and products, and that is expected to be done by the end of the quarter, unless it's like something that's like a really big new feature, then that might take like 2 quarters. But.
Cool. Yeah. So that's a much quicker turnaround. I mean, I think that it doesn't feel so long in architecture, I should say, for the record, just in architecture's defense. I think it's similar where there's phasing and kind of things feel like once you get to a point with SD that it feels sort of complete in a way and things, but it's, it's not the same, obviously. So I love this question. So this is a pair of questions. Obviously, I know you both went to graduate school, but I want to talk about what you feel like you got from Rice that was helpful for the career. Like, do you feel like coming to Rice and going to architecture school was a valid part of your career? Do you feel like you got some stuff from it? And what were those things?
Am I starting this time? Sure. So I think, I definitely think Rice was a great part of my education. I don't think I would have done it differently. I think that Rice architecture gives us a really great foundation for design and just design thinking as a whole. And the way that we're kind of like taught to be incredibly rigorous with our work really does pay off. I think one thing that I think I'm a lot better at than like some of my peers who didn't go to architecture school is like receiving feedback and like actioning on that, because we do so much of the like review process with like jurors and also just like desk work with professors. And I think like from that, I've kind of learned to like not treat a design as like my baby and like everything, and be flexible in that sense. I think that's pretty important in like any design field, but in UX is like really helpful because you're going to have users shooting down your ideas all the time, and you're just going to be like, yes. And so that was probably
is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that was really helpful. I think that in general, like the design world is very similar in that like we always practice like giving feedback and receiving feedback. And so I think I've been able to like help my peers as well by like understanding that process and like know what's like the kind of boundary between criticizing for the sake of criticizing versus like actually trying to give helpful feedback. So great culture there.
Will?
Yeah, I think I would mostly echo that sentiment. I think Rice has taught me a lot, over the course of 6 years. And the most important thing that I learned was critical thinking. I know it sounds kind of a cliche, but it really is what distinguishes some of the more prestigious schools than I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but like more of like skill-based, training programs. When you go to a place like Rice, you got to have your eye on the long shot, right? They're not training for you to graduate and just immediately find a job, which, you probably can do that. But 30 years down the road, you will really see some of the thinkings and the way of, like Metinee was saying, the kind of working on feedbacks or giving feedbacks, receiving feedbacks, as well as there's just like critically think about a problem, not settle with just being okay, and actually have the kind of the resources and the mindset to chase excellence. I know a lot of architecture students, myself included, we're kind of a perfectionist. So, and in a lot of ways, that can be our advantage. So I think that's the biggest thing that I think I took away from Rice, and that's been like beneficial to me in terms of like solid skills. Like that's really depend on the kind of person you are. I just happen to be more of a geek. I was happy working with computers. I got good with software, so I didn't feel that was in any way some people might think, like compared to people who went to programs that focus on training, skill training, Rice might be at a disadvantage. I didn't experience that, but that, that's like me. personally interested in those kind of things, and I knew for my career I wanted to get more into the kind of technical side of things. So I focused on that. So I think that's part of the Rice education. Rice has always been known to be more comprehensive. So they train all kinds of architects. So you can choose to be specialized, or you can choose to remain like a generalist. But in the broader picture, the critical thinking is the most kind of beneficial thing that I learned while I was at Rice.
I feel like you guys are making me feel warm and fuzzy about our program, which is great, but now we're going to do the opposite. So I'd like to talk to you about what the things are that you felt like you were missing. And obviously you guys felt like you were missing some things because you both went to grad school. And I feel like that's it's funny because the next question from a student is, do you feel like UX/UI has low barriers of entry? And I think that it's really tough for people to look at a 6-year undergraduate program and go, you know what I really want to do is sign up for grad school immediately. So tell me a little bit about what it is that grad school gave you, and we'll start with Metinee first and then hop back to Will.
Yeah, for sure. So I think for me, I wanted to learn more about like humans and like the more like cognitive side of things, and understand like how I can serve people better as a designer. I think because in Rice architecture, we focus on like very theoretical design a lot of the times. I found myself like wishing that we had more, like understanding of like what our users would like, or like actually speaking to some people and like seeing what they would want in a building or something like that. I know that's more common for like residential architecture typically, but I haven't really seen it in other types of buildings. And I think it's just not as much part of the design culture as it is in UX. And I think part of that is because like when you're designing a product and technology, obviously you're designing most of the time for a consumer. And if your design doesn't match up with what they need, then it's obviously not going to do very well. And so that has always been kind of ingrained into like the kind of UX design culture. And I wanted to understand more of like specifically the UX research side of things, and like how to kind of get those insights and like really listen to users to figure out what they might want, or how to kind of like translate those insights into good design, and kind of just overall like UX heuristics that are kind of like general best practices for design within the digital realm. So kind of like the Nielsen Norman set of heuristics that a lot of people use to guide their design principles, and just like understanding what good design is like in the digital field.
Yeah. So I guess Jackie, that was a 2-part question, right?
I'm sorry, that was like a 3, 4, 5-part question. I'm sorry. Yeah, because Will specifically, so the last time for those of you who are watching this, Will was in my Revit class, one of my favorite students from Revit days.
Thank you.
And I do remember you being just incredibly quick with technology and things. But and when you went off to Michigan, I remembered that it was an architecturally oriented program, and what you actually did is something that I don't think is offered in many places. Is this correct? So can you talk a little bit about the program before you kind of go into the rest?
Yeah. So that program, just kind of to follow on your question, that program has a focus on digital technology in architecture. I think that's a fancy name for robotics as far as that school is concerned. The University of Michigan takes huge amount of pride in owning like 7 robotic arms. It's like we have the highest number of robotic arms in any architecture school, right? So they really want to take advantage of that and almost in a way orient their program towards like using robotic arms and the application of robotics in architecture. So that said, that program had, or that the grad school degree has a lot of computer programming element in it, because you have to interface with robots. and then that goes to that extends to CNC machines. They're all kind of fabrication machinery. So with that program, I was able to learn a lot more about computers and how to talk to computers and how computers talk to machines, so that the whole communication cycle, and the foundation of that is sort of like programming computers, right? So I think that's something that you don't get from Rice unless you go out of your way and look for it. And it's kind of a niche thing in architecture too. So, and that is not to say that Rice isn't capable of doing that. I think I was recently talking to one of your classmates, I think Ray. He actually went to the same office that I interned, or the preceptorship program, the same office. So we had a little bit of overlap while I was still working there as a designer. So I was talking with him, and he mentioned that Rice has some offerings on like entry-level programming. So if you're into that, you can, as an architecture student, just take that elective, which isn't all that different than what I did in grad school. Like I said, the program I did at Michigan focused on robotics. A lot of the programming is encouraged, but it's not like a required. So like it's kind of left to your. I'm left with the option to either struggle and try to keep up with like communicating with the computer or the robots, or I can just take one of the electives and actually learn programming and do well in it. So, and that's what I did. So I guess let's come back to the question of what kind of qualities or skills you need to learn beyond the Rice program, or whether do you need to go to a grad school. That really depends on what you want to do, as a career. Metinee went to grad school probably with like UX UI positions in mind, and then I went to grad school because I was interested in technology, in architecture, robotics included. So we both went on to grad school after even like a 6-year-long program, because we see there's like that gap, or there's a little bit of a void that we need to fill in order to go on to our specific or like to go after our career goals. But I think if you do want to remain in traditional architecture, that 6-year program is probably more than enough. So it really depends on kind of your personal goals and the plan for the future. And did you ask whether UX UI has a low barrier of entry?
Yeah.
I can just kind of continue onto that part of the question, which I think the answer is pretty simple. I think it is a low barrier of entry, at least from my standpoint, or my experience with it. I didn't have to do too much to get into it. I mean, I'm not, I wouldn't call myself a UX UI designer yet. Like I said, half of my time is still kind of devoted in design objects, or in the kind of interior sense or architectural sense as well. So, but from what I'm doing or what I've been doing, it didn't really take much. So it's not like I had to get a degree, or I didn't even do a boot camp. A lot of these tools with which you create good user experiences, they are not as complicated as 3D modeling or drafting software. And it has a reason not to be. Like I said, the kind of element that you deal with, it's more straightforward than the systems of building. So I think, yes, short answer, it's low barrier of entry.
Yeah, I guess I forgot to answer that part of the question, but I agree. I would say the barriers of entry are definitely lower. I think school, like the main reason is that you don't really have to go to a specific program, whereas in architecture, like there's very much like you go to architecture school to become an architect, whereas a bunch like UX is such a new field still that like so many different people from different backgrounds come into. So like there are people from cognitive science, there are people from like English, there are people from like music. It's really like all over the place. People from computer science, obviously. I would say that, yeah, grad school definitely not 100% necessary. Like boot camps, I've heard, are very valid ways to like learn the kind of like ropes of UX as a whole. As like Will said, the software is like very easy to learn. I picked that up by myself as well. I would say like when it comes to the actual field though, like getting into like getting your first job isn't necessarily as low of a barrier. There is definitely like competition out there. There is a very rigorous like interview process, and like you have to have your portfolio, like but I think that the best way to like learn or like kind of like get your hands into it is to work like with a startup first, or a nonprofit organization who needs like UX help or like design help. And that's one way to get stuff into your portfolio, and also get some like experience under your belt. Because I really do think like if you don't want to do grad school, that's like very normal and like very okay. And like I've met a lot of designers who don't go to grad school. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to get into the field that aren't just through like traditional schooling.
Excellent. So this next question is for Metinee. And so this is that when students come to me and they say, I want to do UX UI, what they've done is they've looked up the average salary as it relates to the average salary of an architect. And they go, that seems similar, but pays a lot more. Which, you know, it's in some places it doesn't, in some places it doesn't. It's funny because I think that these starting salaries seem very different, but it really depends on where you're working, what sector you're doing UX UI design for. And similarly, you know, you can specialize in architecture and make a decent amount of money as a BIM specialist. You know, you can make quite a bit of money doing things for architects. So beyond the potential pay gap, what do you feel like are the benefits of the career over architecture? Like, what's the draw beyond the money?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely see why that's like a big selling point for people. For me, I think that I love working on a product that I know will impact the lives of like so many people. I know that like when you're designing a building, it like feels like that too. But I think technology has such a much further reach, especially if you're working on, so like my company is a fintech company, so I'm working on like an investment product, and that is like investing money is like something that should become like so normalized for everyone. And I love that so many of these companies, their mission is to like bring these things that are traditionally very insular or like usually belong to like a certain group of people or is like quite niche, and they're trying to bring that out into the general population and make that more accessible to people. I think that's a really interesting mission, and like a lot of companies are really trying to like democratize like things like finance or like that are like traditionally quite confusing. And so I think that's like the main thing. And also I like that the iterative process, like, you know, you're able to like work on something and like constantly be changing and updating and making it better and improving it for your user base. I think that's super beneficial. And like, I love being able to do that, because for me, like my work never feels like 100% finished, like being a perfectionist. And I like that you don't have to stress about everything being perfect for, you know, the like launch product, because the expectation is that, you know, you're always improving. And I feel like that is a great philosophy to have for design and for life in general. So yeah.
Nice. So Will, I think that you kind of embody something that I really value, which is like, I don't like to completely leave I've never been comfortable completely leaving architecture. And so it's funny because I still find ways to keep my foot sort of in that world. And I feel like you've really successfully done that. You love the technology and the computers. You got to go to grad school, but it's funny because you find yourself back in this environment again, where you're still kind of involved with architecture. And so I'm curious what you think the benefits are of kind of sticking around with the architects.
Well, it really has to go back to my interest. So I think what I really miss about art, or I guess what I will miss if I leave architecture, is the fact that I get to sculpt objects really. I was never like a good sculptor, or I didn't want to be like an artist. But I did enjoy it a whole lot, the kind of rigorous process of making things in 3D, and not just as a creative expression, but also grounded in physics, grounded in reality. So that has always been exciting to me, and that never changed. That's why I went to architecture school, and I never really wanted to leave. So I think I as I guess as a advice to a lot of people is, if people find my path sort of a good model to follow in any way, I think it really is. You just gotta follow what you enjoy, what you love to do. I think I didn't stick entirely with architecture, like the traditional architecture, because it is. I honestly think that the profession is it's not the best structure, right? And the kind of product delivery and the contract are not set up, or I guess a better word for that is it needs to be modernized a little bit more. Speaking of which, I think in a lot of the technology space, there are startups or technology companies that are trying really hard to break into this, and people see a lot of opportunity, and that they want to solve it with the technology and software. But that's kind of a separate story. Coming back to, like, in terms of traditional architecture, I couldn't follow through with it because just there's a lack of the kind of cut and dry metrics that a lot of the other professions have. It's really hard to kind of define what your end goals are, and a lot of the times you end up just kind of repeating same things over and over again. And that is not to say that you don't get that in other fields, but I think I mentioned earlier, the project cycle, at least in UX and UI, are much shorter. And then on the sculpting side, so to speak, I am in a much smaller scale. So that allowed me to work in shorter project cycles as well. I used to work on giant, super tall, like skyscrapers, and then that's just the sheer scale of it, the complexity involved, all the different parties that needs to come together at the table. It just makes it such a exhausting experience. So I chose to kind of go to slightly more adjacent areas, but still have my 1 foot within it, so that I can get that that joy from making shapes. So
I always joke that architecture there's some sort of inherent Stockholm syndrome where we all just we just can't quite leave, just can't quite walk away. And it's funny too, because I've sent, unfortunately for you guys, because I know you and because I love you guys, I've sent students to you with some frequency and go, you really need to talk. I think, Metinee, didn't I send you to Will first? I was like, this is the only person I know who's vaguely doing anything like what you want to do.
You did, yeah.
Yeah. One of my classmates actually went to full-time UX UI too. I think she also works at a fintech. That's the person that I recommend to Metinee. I don't know if you guys got in touch, but I just kind of left it there. But yeah, she was the first that I know of. But right now it's just like there's a lot of need in the field, so that's why you're seeing a lot of switching over, which is natural.
Yep. And that's why when I send students to you, I feel like it runs the gamut from people who don't really know anything about it and are just going, I'm kind of burnt out on architecture. I need a different focus. I need to get out of here or something, to people who are going, I'm going to say I've not met many, I haven't met anybody like you yet who's been like this. I have a fully realized concept that I'm going to follow. This is the plan. Here are the steps. But that there are a lot that are feeling sort of an agitation of how do I turn this into something that's a fulfilling career for me? But I think that there are some really common misconceptions about what this life is like and how it's going to solve all the problems. So If there's anything that you find that's commonly misunderstood when you talk to students, I would be curious to hear those things.
I'll start because my answer is going to be short. I don't think I have a whole lot in this because I haven't talked to many people who are interested. Like I said, if you just put in UX UI Rice University, I don't think I'm the first one that comes up. So I don't attract a lot of those questions. I have maybe one or two over the past few years, but just kind of from my perspective, I thought UX and UI was a lot of design, but I think maybe it's the same with architecture, depending on what kind of architecture you're doing. But I can just speak to my, like right now, currently what I'm working on. It's a lot of copy and pasting rather than designing. I think that's like the biggest misconception, or quote unquote misconception that I had. It's much more functional than it is aesthetic. Not to say that it isn't. It's just to be able to work at the kind of industry scale or speed. There's a lot of things that are already figured out. You don't have to redesign the button over and over again. It's already there. There are a few different flavors. Like there's the whole Google material design. That's like a whole thing on its own. You just copy and paste and focus on the UX rather than the UI. So less designy.
Yeah, I would say I agree with Will in the sense that like a lot of people who have come to me have been curious about like how much visual impact that you'll have as a designer working in UX. And I would say like, although like there are teams that you can work on that work specifically on like the design system, so like the look and feel of an app or a product, for the most part, UX designers aren't really the ones who are deciding on like color scheme, like branding and like typography. For that, like I think you're going more into like the marketing space. Like for example, the company that I'm working at, SoFi, like we take the color scheme from the marketing team and like implement that onto our design. We change it up a little bit because of like usability issues, but very much a lot of that graphic stuff is more on the marketing side, I would say. Again, like it really depends on what kind of company you're working at. Like the earlier stage it is, the more input you'll have on like aesthetics and like overall look and feel. But the more mature the company is, the more likely it is that you'll be kind of working on like day to day, just like rearranging elements on a screen to make it more usable, like implementing like updating features or like user feedback, etc. I would say like I still consider that design very much, but I think I definitely see Will's point when it comes to like sometimes it does feel like you're copy and pasting. But yeah, that was kind of like the main misconception, that like you're not really exercising your design vision on this product as much as like I feel like a lot of architects like to do, or like that's what we kind of did in school. It's more like you're there to serve the users and like be a voice for them in the like otherwise like technology world, and kind of advocate for their needs and try to design for what would be best for that audience.
It's crazy because as you say this, I feel like they're just so related, because I worked for many years as an architect, and I'll say like, when you're saying like, the button's the button, there are a few flavors like doors and windows, like there's only so much you can do. It's kind of the same iterations of things. You're really constrained to ADA, you're really constrained to fire code. Like there's a lot of things that make it where what you see in architecture school is not functionally what it's like as an architect. I would say then probably it seems very similar that what we're doing here in school is probably the most creatively boundless area. And functionally from the day to day, I'm finding just from talking to you now that you guys, your sphere is very, to me feels very, and I mean, Will, you worked Metinee never really worked professionally as an architect, right? You never were in the office environment for a long period of time, but Will, I would say like, I feel like I'm seeing just like a ton of similarities, and that like, I think people assume that you spend your day, you know, drawing sketches on napkins and your drafting table and all these things that kind of we stereotypically assume about architects, but that it is a lot of very similar things about spacing and movement and the minor sort of details that make something usable and beautiful. It's just what the actual product is, and then sort of who the louder voices are in the room that are kind of pushing those decisions then. That's really interesting. Okay, so I did want to ask you which is more designery. I feel like we've kind of settled that situation. We kind of know who's doing more creative things, and the answer is it could be any of us, I think, depending on, maybe not me, but any of you guys, it could be. The question then is sort of, this is the twofold question again, sort of what are the things that make you really competitive or what make you irreplaceable as a UX UI designer? But then also I think just functionally, what's the stuff that you've got to learn? Like, I think that boot camps are great, and I should plug Rice's boot camps, I guess. I feel like that's a fair thing for me to do, that Rice does UX UI boot camps through the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies. I don't have their website or anything. It's not that much of a plug, but I know that there are places that will teach you sort of the fundamentals. And I know that there are things like C++, and there are like a couple of others I don't really know, but go ahead and tell me the things that you think are, I mean, obviously we can leave off the qualities that we all know come from Rice architecture, intelligent thinking and design sort of oriented thinking, but what are the other sort of base skills, and then what are the softwares, and whoever.
Yeah, I can go first, I guess. So I think that a key skill is like, well, I guess this is more of like something you learn over time, but like empathy and the ability to like listen to the people who are going to be using your product or are using your product. Because I think it's not necessarily like, people don't really, like, a lot of the times what people say and say they want isn't necessarily what ends up being like exactly what it is that they want. So the way you execute on that is a little different. Like, you don't literally follow like people's feedback, right? That's part of being the designer and like solving that problem. I think that's really valuable, and like kind of the ability to like put aside your own personal like design agenda to really like listen to others, as well as like stakeholders who are kind of like more well-versed in the area or like understand the field better, to kind of like bring together all those perspectives and like mesh that into like your design. I think it's also really important to like realize that a lot of the time like good UX design isn't that flashy gradient or like some like quirky animation. It's very much stuff that you don't notice. Seamless UX design, a lot of people say, is just something that like works perfectly, is convenient, and like just makes the user like complete their task quickly, and they don't even like notice it a lot of the time. And a lot of people would say like that is the best kind of UX, right? Like stuff that you don't notice is like consciously happening, but makes your life easier. In terms of like skills and like maybe like software, I know for a fact that programming is not required of designers. It's nice to like know a bit about coding and like have that understanding of how coding works so that you can like interface with the engineers better. But that's kind of like the only space that you really need to know about it and like understand it for. It's really just there to help you better kind of understand your partners and like figure out, you know, like, is this really feasible? Like, am I giving you a design timeline that's like too crazy, etc. So coding isn't really a necessary skill. I would say programs are mostly like Sketch and Figma. Figma is kind of the more widely used one now because there's like cloud collaboration. And aside for that, like knowing like the Adobe Creative Suite tools, I think are helpful, but like I didn't use it at all during my internship. I don't know that many people do, just because it's so heavy. People used to make screens in Illustrator, I think, but now it's not really used anymore because Sketch and Figma are so much more lightweight. So yeah, that's pretty much what I would recommend.
Yeah, I think I will speak to, I guess, the programming side of things. I really don't think so. Metinee, I would second that. You don't really need to be programming computers to go into UX UI. There's very little need. I was programming computers mostly because I was like I said, I was doing architecture. Actually, I was doing more experimental architecture. That's why I got into programming, and the jobs that I've had have been more of the R&D kind of positions and like the guerrilla groups in the company. So we just have to, or I just had to learn to do million different things. So programming, of course, is part of it because nowadays you do need to you do many things. You kind of have to learn to program things like data analysis or automation. And in the UX UI sphere, there are I might be using the term incorrectly. Metinee, you can correct me, but they're like full stack developers who are doing the front end and the back end. Although they're still going to be like engineers who implement the designs, I don't think they design, so to speak. So yeah, so I think if that's what you want to go into, like Metinee was saying, it's more of an engineering role. So you don't have to waste your time trying to get into programming if you want to be UX UI design. So Figma for sure is popular. I was 5 minutes before the call, I was in Figma, moving things around. So that's like, it's web-based, so you can access it anywhere. Those kind of things are becoming really convenient and easy to use. I think Figma has like 5 buttons on the ribbon, so you can only, it's very simple, simple and clean and minimal. But then you can do a lot of things because that tool itself has gone through many iterations. So it's like tested and true kind of thing. A lot of people are using that to do these interfaces, and I think we have to kind of remember that UX UI, a lot of it, I guess the bulk of the work, or should I say the more interesting part of the work, is on the UX, the experience and the user study, the kind of communication that you have to do. Just get your clients to communicate their ideas and implement those rather than, let's say, drafting or artistic authoring of beautiful shapes, right? So I think programming it's good to understand, but you don't really need to. So a lot of the skills that you have from Rice is probably enough. If you, I would I would think that everyone coming out of Rice would know some kind of graphic tools like the Adobe suite, and if you know that, a Figma is a piece of cake. So you guys are set. In terms of like the hard skills, there are many ways to define skills and many kind of skills, but in terms of those, technology wise, I think you guys shouldn't worry too much.
Cool. I'm sure that they will be thrilled to hear that. So for those of you, it's kind of nice that there are just a few of you on here. If you have any questions that you want to ask right here before we sign off, you can throw them in the chat. And what I'm going to do is I'll start with Will and ask you guys if there's just anything else you want to add while we wait to see if they have any questions. And then we'll kind of wrap it up. So is there anything else that they should know, or any advice that you'd want to give them, or anything like that?
Jackie, you mentioned that I think I caught it in kind of as a fleeting moment, but you asked what makes you like irreplaceable to be a UX UI designer. I think Metinee, you can correct me if you think otherwise, but I think it's easier to be irreplaceable in architecture than in UX UI, just because of like UX UI is such a kind of a fast, it's in like a lot of it is in the tech world, and in being in the tech world, I don't know if you guys have seen this TV show Silicon Valley. I suspect a lot of you have seen it, and it's supposed to be funny, but I think it has a lot of truth in it. So I feel like just from a kind of half outsider perspective, I think there's more volatility in UX UI, just in terms of like, speaking of irreplaceable or stability, forget it. I feel like, if you want that, then maybe stick with architecture. But there's definitely, with a little bit of volatility comes a lot of excitement. So I think that's what if you're into that, that should be something that you should pursue, and not worry about being irreplaceable at a job. You know, like the best job is to work for yourself. So you should work towards that goal rather than trying to be irreplaceable at a company. That's my 2 cents.
I think I can kind of speak to like the stability and volatility thing. I don't know that I would say it's incredibly volatile or like unstable. I've found that like most people have been able to stay at their jobs because there's such a short supply of like UX designers right now. Like the field is currently growing really intensely, and like a lot of people are trying to get into it, but like I think good designers are still quite hard to come by, and it's not like you can just pluck one out of thin air. I think things that can make you, well, not necessarily irreplaceable, because I don't believe in that as a fact, but to make you like valuable to your company, I think the most important, like one of the most important things is like being able to work with your partners really well, like your other product partners. So like product managers, like engineers and like researchers, and understand what their priorities are, like what their job entails, and like kind of trying to like marry that into your design as well, because at the end of the day, like if other people feel like you understand what they're doing, you have a better relationship with them. I also think like as a whole, like it is difficult to be like irreplaceable, but like good designers are hard to come by. I do think that Rice Architecture does equip us with a lot of skills to like be good designers. And so like value that in yourself, and like know that you're probably a pretty good designer, and like better than someone who only ever took like a 6-month boot camp on how to design. So.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, and I would say similar to architecture, like we work with a lot of different groups of people. You gotta, that's a skill. And it's funny because it's not a skill that we really do a lot in architecture school. There's a lot of like one man on the hill at his desk, you know? So it's an interesting thing when you get out into the work world and you've suddenly got a bunch of voices whose priorities aren't design, and adjusting to that is always difficult. I feel like it's like, what do you mean that that's not the most important thing to you? Of course it is. All right, so we've got 2 questions. One is, why exactly is it that Adobe isn't really used?
I think it's just a really heavy tool. Like it takes a long time to open, takes a long time to save. Like there's just too much going on there, like too many things that you can do like capability wise that you really just don't need in UX a lot of the time. And then also there's the fact that it's not like a collaborative software. A lot of the times like designers will go into the same file and work on stuff together. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Also, how would you guys recommend Rice architecture students get into UI UX? My portfolio mostly consists of architecture work. So would it be helpful to start my own UI UX projects to get an internship next summer? I will be a junior next fall. I can answer some of that for you, which is yes, it is helpful for you to do things like get involved with, is it Rice Design, Metinee? Like there are like a few things on campus you can do.
Rice Apps is like the startup kind of area within Rice. So like they have engineers and designers working on like different products together. I think Cloris from the architecture school knows a bit about that. And then Rice Design does more like events and workshops and stuff. And I would say like probably more like beginner designers that would be helpful for. But I definitely think to get the experience you would need and like projects under your belt for UX UI, like Rice Apps is your best bet.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's funny because I talk to students about, like, for instance, they want to go into set design, and I say, go find the people who need set designers on campus. And I mean, I don't like to say you should work for free, but I think that when you're trying to break into new skills and new environments, and you're expecting folks to kind of absorb your learning curve in a way like that, especially in college where you're kind of all just grinding along and there's not a lot of budget, it's a really great way to get involved with stuff where the sort of relative risk is pretty low in terms of if it crashes and burns, you know, it's not a job you're losing or something like that.
Yeah, and it's nice because like you're also trying to learn from them. Like you're probably like, at least for the beginning, like you're providing less value than they are to you. And so like, I mean, it kind of makes sense like that you don't like, you wouldn't get paid for that, especially within like Rice community organizations and stuff. But also like, I think it's really valuable because you get to work with like the computer scientists and like product manager roles like on campus. So like you kind of get to have a network as well of like people who are probably going to be your coworkers at some point or like your peers in the tech world. So that's always helpful to like know a few people around.
I feel like at this point, our Rice architecture students could make their own UI, UX interest group and do projects. There are so many of them. It's funny too, because I think all the time, like we just need ancillary programs. You know, these huge schools, they've got architecture, but they've got like these minor specializations in like 57 things. You know, we've got 200 students. We're smaller than most people's, like as a whole school, we're smaller than most people's undergraduate programs. But I think that, and I think that part of the problem with a small program like this is that our resources, our formalized resources aren't great. And so I'm really grateful to you guys for taking your time for free, for me, for our students, to really help. This has been an amazing sort of moment for us to just have this as a resource. And just for your own personal interest, we're going to be doing more of these with other backgrounds, different things, architecture and non-architecture related. And so I'm just really looking forward to catching up with everybody. But again, thank you so very much for doing this for me, guys. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure that our students will as soon as they get to see it too.
Thank you so much, Jackie.
Oh,
You're
yeah,
so
thanks for putting it
helpful.
together.
You're
Okay.
doing the best work.
We try. All right, I'm going to hit stop record on this. And students, if you have any questions after this that you'd like to get to Will or Metinee, you can filter them through me so that I can send them one email of 50 questions instead of 50 emails of one question.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
Right now?
Yes.
I have a question for, well, both of you, but Will more because I've already talked to Metinee. So for someone who like me, who's like applying in the fall, obviously like once I get onto campus, like I'll try and get more involved with the organizations that are on campus, like Rice Apps and like you said. But I was just wondering, like for you, Will, like in your portfolio when you were applying to grad school, did you also have a lot of UX UI projects, or was it more architecture? Like, you know, what was how important, this is a question for both of you, like how important do you think it is to have kind of your like UX UI projects in your portfolio?
I didn't have to have any because the program that I was in was not a UX UI program. So I applied with a regular architecture portfolio. So.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would say for me, I had all the necessary, like I did a bunch of UX work. It wasn't like super like exciting or like very sophisticated in any way. Like I learned that, you know, like a lot of it was not like afterwards I learned in school that like, okay, some of this is like not that great. But I think it just shows that you're like passionate and you've thought about it and like you have that interest, and that's basically what it's demonstrating. But again, like a lot of my peers didn't have portfolios coming in because they weren't in design backgrounds. So definitely not necessary in any way, but nice to have and shows your passion.
Thank you.
Of course.
Hello. All right, so sorry, I know, just always. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hit stop record on this. You guys, again, thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, you can email them to me. My email is jschaef, SCHAEF @rice.edu. And I guess we'll see you next time.